A young state trooper set out on patrol one rainy night in 1985 and was never seen again. What investigators found in his abandoned cruiser still haunts the force to this day. Flashlight broken, no sign of him. And the silence that followed was deafening. Before we go deeper into the chilling case of Trooper Daniel Reese and the secrets buried beneath that Montana highway, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories take time, research, and heart to bring to light, and your support makes all the difference. It's a small gesture from you, but it helps us keep uncovering the truths others left behind. Thank you. 13 years later, a buried car and a chilling letter would unravel a secret the state had tried to forget. The Montana Highway Patrol thought they'd lost a young trooper to the night. What they discovered 13 years later proved far more sinister. Trooper Daniel Reese had been wearing the uniform for only 6 months. At just 24, he was the youngest member of the Montana Highway Patrol's Eastern District, a rookie with a reputation for taking the job seriously, maybe too seriously. Tall, lean, and methodical, Daniel had graduated top of his class from the state academy. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, he was dependable. That rainy night in October 1985, when he pulled out of the station just after 6 p.m., no one could have guessed it would be the last time they saw him. The night was unremarkable at first. A low, steady drizzle had blanketed the rolling plains east of Billings. Visibility was limited but manageable. Traffic was light on Route 89, a 2-lane stretch of road that carved through farmland, creeks, and old mining ghost towns. Daniel radioed in at 7:38 p.m. to confirm a routine traffic stop near mile marker 237. The voice on the other end barely registered the transmission. It was that ordinary. "Copy that," dispatch replied. "Routine stop." Then, silence. When 15 minutes passed with no follow-up, dispatch pinged Daniel's call sign. No response. Another 5 minutes. Nothing. The silence wasn't alarming yet. Radios dropped out all the time in the hills. But when 30 minutes passed with still no word, protocol kicked in. A second unit was dispatched. They found his patrol cruiser pulled halfway off the road on a bend just before a wooded stretch known locally as Devil's Elbow. The driver's door was open. The engine still idled, wipers swiping rhythmically across the windshield, brushing away the steady mist. Daniel's hat was on the hood. His flashlight lay in the grass a few feet away, its lens cracked, the beam dead. But Daniel was gone. No skid marks, no sign of a struggle, no footprints leading into the woods. The rain had made sure of that. His sidearm was still holstered in the car. The radio had shorted out, likely from water exposure, but the logs showed no emergency transmission after the routine call. A single set of tire impressions, distinctly not from the cruiser, were found in the mud behind the car, but they led back to the road and disappeared. They matched neither police vehicles nor any local registered car. The community was shaken. Daniel had grown up just 2 counties over. He wasn't just another trooper, he was a local boy, a football star, the kid who came back to serve. His parents, Darlene and Clyde Reese, appeared on the local news the next day, holding back tears, pleading for anyone who had seen anything to come forward. For days, search teams scoured the area. Helicopters circled the nearby hills. K-9 units trailed into the woods, only to lose scent halfway up a logging path. Flyers went up across Montana and into neighboring states. A statewide BOLO was issued for any car resembling the one witnesses claimed to have seen, a dark blue sedan with no plates, but no one came forward. No suspects, no bodies, no answers. By the end of the week, Daniel's badge number was retired, his cruiser stripped and reassigned. But to those who worked with him, who searched for him, who knew him, something about that night never sat right. A trooper doesn't just vanish. Not without someone noticing. Not without a trace. Something had happened out there on Route 89, and whatever it was, it had left a mark. They just hadn't found it yet. By the time the second unit reached mile marker 237, the rain had shifted from a soft drizzle to a relentless downpour. The clock on the dash read 8:41 p.m. Trooper Mark Dwyer stepped out of his cruiser into the wet night, scanning the roadside for any sign of Daniel Reese or the car he'd pulled over. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the darkness in steady arcs until it landed on a familiar shape, Daniel's patrol vehicle. Parked at an angle, halfway on the shoulder, the driver's side door hung open like a wound left unattended. Its emergency lights were off, casting no red-blue warning glow across the landscape. Something felt wrong immediately. Dwyer approached cautiously, his boots squelching in the mud. The cruiser's engine was still humming. The windshield wipers thudded in slow motion, rhythmically pushing aside sheets of rain. Inside, the dashboard was illuminated, the radio crackling with soft static. Daniel's shotgun was still locked in its mount. His sidearm department issue remained holstered in the belt loop, hanging over the driver's seat. The keys were still in the ignition. Then Dwyer saw Daniel's Stetson, soaked through, resting on the hood, like it had been placed there deliberately. Not tossed, not dropped, placed. A few feet away, lying half in the mud and half on the tall, wet grass, was a flashlight. Its casing was cracked, lens shattered. No light came from it. Dwyer scanned the surrounding area again, instinctively drawing his weapon now. The roadside was eerily silent, the only sound the rain hammering the asphalt, and the occasional wind through the pines that lined the curve of the highway. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no broken glass. Nothing that suggested a confrontation, just the eerie calm of abandonment. Within minutes, backup arrived. Troopers fanned out, combing the stretch of road in both directions, calling Reese's name. A perimeter was set up, and the sheriff's office was notified. A full-scale search began before midnight. They brought in dogs, who picked up a scent that led a few hundred yards into the woods before vanishing altogether. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, the rain finally eased, but the daylight offered no new answers. Reese was simply gone. Forensics found one potential lead. Tire tracks in the mud behind Daniel's cruiser, barely visible after hours of rain. They weren't made by a patrol vehicle. Measurements suggested a mid-size sedan, older model, maybe 72nd or early 82nd. The treads didn't match any car reported in the area. The tracks led back onto the road and disappeared heading north. The lack of physical evidence confounded investigators. There was no forced entry, no indication of a pursuit, and no distress signal. It was as if Reese had stepped out of the vehicle and simply vanished into the storm. His last radio transmission, a calm report of a routine traffic stop, gave no hint of alarm. And yet, in under 20 minutes, something had gone very wrong. The troopers who arrived that night would speak of a strange stillness, a heaviness in the air that lingered even after the rain passed. Veterans with decades on the force confessed privately that something about the scene unsettled them in ways they couldn't explain. A patrol car abandoned mid-shift, a trooper's gear left behind, and a young man's sudden disappearance with no witness, no sound, no struggle. It became a story passed quietly among officers, a whispered cautionary tale they called the patrol that never ended. Daniel Reese had vanished, and with him, a sense of certainty that the badge could always protect its own. The morning after Trooper Daniel Reese's disappearance, the Montana Highway Patrol officially declared a Code Red officer missing. It was the first time such a designation had been used in over a decade, and it sent shockwaves through the department. By dawn, the command center at the Billings field office had transformed into a nerve center of activity. Maps were pinned across walls, radios buzzed constantly, and exhausted officers pored over every detail from the scene. The sense of urgency was absolute. One of their own had vanished, and the clock was already ticking. Helicopters were deployed first. They swept over the vast and unforgiving terrain east of Route 89. Hovering over canyons, ridges, and abandoned mining paths that hadn't seen footprints in years. From the sky, the landscape looked like a patchwork of endless green and brown, trees thick as secrets. Meanwhile, dozens of ground teams were dispatched in every direction, armed with search dogs, radios, and the grim determination that they might be looking for a body. By day 2, the operation had grown into one of the largest manhunts in Montana's modern history. Over 200 volunteers from surrounding counties joined troopers, sheriff's deputies, and even off-duty firefighters to scour the area. Locals set up food tents and supply stations. Newspapers printed Daniel's face on their front pages alongside bold headlines, "Where is Trooper Reese?" The story spread beyond state lines. News crews arrived, camera vans stationed just outside the highway blockade, asking questions no one could answer. The Reese family held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Daniel's mother stood behind the microphone, clutching a folded photo of her son in uniform. Her voice trembled as she asked the public for help, any information, no matter how small. His father stood silently beside her, jaw clenched, eyes focused on the horizon. For them, the days were unbearable, filled with uncertainty and dread. They couldn't sleep, they couldn't eat, they waited. But as the hours turned to days, and the days into weeks, the optimism began to wither. The search grid expanded, but hope contracted. Every potential lead abandoned cabins, disturbed soil, reported sightings led to nothing. The dogs caught no new scent. The helicopters found no clearing disturbed. It was as if Daniel had been swallowed whole by the earth. Rumors began to circulate, that he had staged his own disappearance, that he'd gotten involved with the wrong people, that it was an inside job. But those closest to him knew better. Daniel didn't run. He didn't hide. He'd lived by the book, by the badge. His fellow officers stopped entertaining theories and started fearing the worst, that he had crossed paths with someone who wanted him silenced. As the pressure mounted, cracks began to form inside the department. Some questioned whether protocol had been followed closely enough that night. Dispatchers were reviewed. Supervisors scrutinized. The highway patrol, usually a stoic and unified force, found itself pulled taut by grief and suspicion. Still, the search continued sporadically, stubbornly, and ultimately unsuccessfully. After a month, the command center closed. Officially, the case remained open. Unofficially, whispers of resignation filled the halls. Daniel Reese had vanished, and Montana had no answers. Only silence, only shadows, and a hollow place where justice should have been. The lead came in 3 days after Trooper Daniel Reese vanished. A local farmer named Harold Kinney had been hauling feed along Route 89 the night Daniel went missing. During his interview with deputies, he mentioned something odd, barely a detail at first, but one that made the room go quiet. Around 7:30 p.m., just before the rain intensified, Harold recalled seeing a car parked on the shoulder a mile south of where Reese's cruiser was later found. It was an older model, dark blue, maybe a Ford or a Chevy, though Harold wasn't sure. What struck him wasn't the car itself, but the way it was parked, nose angled toward the woods, engine off, lights out, just sitting there like it was waiting. Harold slowed slightly, thinking maybe someone had engine trouble, but the driver never flagged him down. He glanced at the rear of the vehicle. No license plate. Just a black rectangle where one should have been. Then the rain came harder, and he kept driving. That account opened a floodgate. Over the next 2 days, 2 more witnesses came forward independently. One, a long-haul trucker from Idaho. The other, a woman returning from a church event with her daughter. Both recalled seeing a dark-colored sedan along the same stretch of road that night, roughly around the time Daniel made his last call. Both described it in nearly the same words: older model, navy or midnight blue, no plates, headlights off, almost blending into the storm. It was the first tangible lead in an otherwise confounding case. For a brief window, it ignited hope. Composite sketches of the vehicle were drawn based on the vague descriptions, though the make and model remained uncertain. Officers began checking nearby garages, junkyards, and repair shops. Roadblocks were reactivated temporarily, and troopers began pulling over similar vehicles across the state, checking VINs and registration records. Nothing matched, nothing came close. The absence of a license plate was particularly troubling. It meant the vehicle was either intentionally stripped or never registered. If it had been involved in Daniel's disappearance, someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it couldn't be traced. A bolo was sent to neighboring states. The FBI briefly consulted on the matter, advising local authorities on how to track down vehicles based on paint traces, aftermarket parts, or unique damage patterns. But without a plate, without a make or model, and with no surveillance infrastructure in the area, they were chasing a ghost. The media seized on the phrase, "the mysterious sedan," and it became the focal point of public speculation. Was it a getaway car? A trap? Was it even connected to Daniel's disappearance, or just an eerie coincidence? The highway patrol couldn't say for sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at them. Weeks passed, leads dried up. Calls about suspicious cars became white noise. The sedan, once a beacon of possibility, dissolved into rumor and fog. The sketch was filed away. The case returned to its grim stasis. And somewhere, if the car had meant something, if it had carried someone who knew what happened to Trooper Daniel Reese, it had long since disappeared into the vast expanse of rural Montana, leaving only a question mark in its wake. The silence was the worst part, not the cold calls or the dead ends, not even the slow fade of reporters and search crews. It was the silence, the kind that creeps into a family's bones when hope is the only thing left to hold. For Darlene Reese, Daniel's mother, every ticking second was a reminder that no one had called to say her son was coming home. In the weeks following Daniel's disappearance, the Reese household in Laurel had become a revolving door of neighbors, reporters, investigators, and church friends bringing casseroles and soft condolences. At first, Darlene welcomed them with tight-lipped gratitude. She would stand in the hallway, clutching a framed photo of Daniel in his academy uniform, his smile wide and youthful, unaware of what lay ahead. She'd retell the same stories, how he used to talk about becoming a trooper since he was 10, how proud he was to wear the badge, how he used to wake up at dawn to practice drills in their backyard. Clyde, her husband, would sit nearby, his eyes vacant, nodding occasionally but saying little. It was Darlene who kept the search alive, even as the spotlight dimmed. At first, the press conferences were held twice a week. Darlene would appear in front of the courthouse, flanked by law enforcement and sometimes by Daniel's academy friends. Cameras clicked. Journalists asked the same questions. Have there been any new leads? Do you believe Daniel is still alive? Her answers were unwavering. Yes, she'd say. My son would not leave us. Someone knows something. But as the months passed, fewer reporters came. The search was no longer front-page news. Another case, another story, took its place. The weekly press briefings shrank to monthly updates, then stopped altogether. The Reese family watched as the world slowly let go, while they remained suspended in a kind of emotional purgatory, no body to bury, no answers to grieve, just the unbearable absence of closure. The community, too, began to shift. The initial flood of support became a trickle. Some whispered theories in diners and church pews. Maybe Daniel had run off. Maybe he'd crossed a line. Maybe it was something darker, something involving people no one dared to name out loud. The speculation hurt almost as much as the silence. Still, Darlene never stopped calling the department. Every week, like clockwork, she phoned the lead investigator. Sometimes they answered, sometimes they didn't. She left voicemails filled with a mother's aching hope. Any update? Did the FBI say anything? Did you find the car? Each message ended the same way. Please don't stop looking. He's still out there. She kept Daniel's room just as he left it. His academy books stacked neatly on the desk, his boots polished and lined up beneath the window. On the dresser sat his first badge, encased in glass, next to a candle she lit every night. She refused to speak of him in the past tense. While the rest of the world moved on, Darlene Reese stood firm in her quiet despair, refusing to let time swallow her son. In her heart, Daniel wasn't lost. He was waiting somewhere. And until he came home, she would not give up. In the winter of 1992, the cold came early and hard across the Montana plains, bringing with it a stillness that seemed to freeze even the past. For most, Trooper Daniel Reese's disappearance had become a quiet footnote in the town's collective memory, a tragic mystery locked away in the archives of the Billings precinct, buried under newer crimes and fresher headlines. But for retired Detective Harold Denning, the case had never really gone away. It lingered like a shadow at the back of his mind, re-emerging in quiet moments, tugging at a part of him that had never settled with the way it ended. Denning had spent 37 years with the force, the last decade of it heading major crimes before retiring in 1989. A heart attack had finally slowed him down, forcing him into early retirement. But his mind never stopped working. Some nights, especially in the long silence after his wife passed, he'd pour himself a drink, pull out old files, and try to make sense of the unsolved. He called them his ghosts. Daniel Reese's file had always been the loudest among them. It was a Sunday afternoon when he finally reopened the thick manila folder bearing Reese's name. The paper inside had yellowed at the edges. He read slowly, carefully, taking notes on a legal pad with the same precision that once made him the most respected investigator in the district. The timeline was familiar. The last radio call at 7:38 p.m. The cruiser found abandoned an hour later. The manhunt, the mysterious blue sedan with no plates, he remembered it all. But it was a single entry buried near the bottom of the report log that made him stop. A handwritten incident note dated the same night Reese disappeared, time-stamped 8:12 p.m. A 911 call from a trucker passing through an old mining road about 30 miles north of Route 89. The man had reported a loud crash in the woods just off the highway, said he'd seen taillights vanishing into the trees, followed by the distinct sound of metal slamming into something hard. He thought it might have been an accident, maybe a deer strike or someone losing control on the wet road. Denning blinked. He didn't remember this part ever being followed up. He flipped through the rest of the file, checking for a follow-up report. Nothing. No officer dispatched. No site visit. The call had been marked as low priority and logged during the height of the search for Reese. With resources stretched thin and the call coming from an unincorporated area, it had been quietly buried beneath the chaos. He circled the entry, heart beating faster now. The location was remote, barely used, and known mostly to locals and loggers. It wasn't part of the official search radius. Back then, the theory was that Reese had been taken south, maybe even out of state. But this new thread pointed in a different direction entirely. North. Into the woods. Denning picked up the phone and called the station. The young officer who answered didn't recognize his name at first. But after a moment, Denning's tone made something click. Pull the crash report log from the 17th of October, 1985, he said firmly. Search for anything within 30 miles north of mile marker 237. I think we missed something. For the first time in years, the file that had gathered dust began to breathe again. What had once been dismissed as an irrelevant noise in the night now stood out like a flare in the darkness. And in that forgotten crash, Denning sensed a crack in the silence, a place where answers might finally be hiding. The morning was dry and sharp, the kind of morning where even the cold feels brittle. A demolition crew had been contracted to clear the remnants of an old auto salvage yard on the outskirts of Fort Rock, a nearly forgotten stretch of Montana just beyond the last strip of paved road. The yard had sat untouched for decades, a decaying graveyard of twisted metal and shattered glass, long since overtaken by weeds, rust, and silence. The land had finally been sold to a development firm, and now the wreckage of forgotten vehicles was being cleared, one mangled husk at a time. The foreman, Rick Tolley, had seen his share of strange finds in places like this: old bootlegger stashes hidden in trunks, family photos preserved under backseats, even a human skull once, though that turned out to be from an animal poacher's morbid collection. But what the claw operator unearthed that afternoon was something else entirely. It happened around midday. A massive mechanical claw plunged into a tangled heap of compressed steel, dragging up a half-crushed vehicle that had been buried under 3 other frames. As the rain-worn carcass was dropped to the clearing area, something about its shape caught Rick's eye. He walked over, wiping his gloves on his jeans, and stared at the vehicle as the other workers paused to see what he was so focused on. The car was old, clearly from the late 72nd or early 82nd, judging by its square build and heavy chrome accents. Its body had collapsed in on itself from the weight of years, its roof bent nearly to the seats, glass long gone. The paint had eroded, but faint patches of navy blue clung to the undercarriage, like bruises. The license plate was missing, not rusted, not damaged, simply gone. Rick called the sheriff's office, partly out of procedure, mostly out of instinct. Something about the car felt wrong, felt out of place. The responding deputies agreed. It didn't belong to the salvage yard's inventory. It had never been logged, never processed. The yard had been shuttered in early 1986, just months after Trooper Daniel Reese disappeared. When the VIN was eventually recovered, bent and corroded beneath the hood, it was run through the national database. The result came back with a chilling silence. No registration, no owner. The vehicle had never been reported stolen or sold. It was, as far as the system was concerned, invisible. But the model, an early 82nd Ford Limited, matched the description that 3 witnesses had given back in 1985. Dark blue, no plates, older body style, the mysterious sedan. Word reached retired Detective Harold Denning within days. He made the drive himself, standing quietly in front of the crushed frame, eyes narrowed as if trying to see the past through the rust. As investigators combed through the interior, they found something that made the air freeze around them. Lodged between the collapsed front seats was a scrap of cloth, faded, torn, but unmistakably uniform blue. Just above the seam was the faint outline of a silver button, stamped with the Montana Highway Patrol emblem. Beneath the floor mat, wrapped around a coil of electrical wire, was a fragment of leather with a worn nameplate, half rotted, but still legible: Reese. The car had been buried beneath decades of neglect, hidden among the discarded and forgotten. But now, crushed and broken as it was, it had finally spoken. And what it revealed would unravel everything the force thought it knew. The forensic garage at the Montana State Police headquarters hadn't seen activity like this in years. The wreckage had been brought in under heavy tarp, flanked by state troopers who treated it less like a rusted-out husk and more like a coffin. The air in the bay was thick with anticipation, as specialists and investigators circled the crushed vehicle. Every dented panel, every thread of fabric, every trace of what had been sealed inside was now under a microscope. What had once been buried in a forgotten salvage yard was now the centerpiece of a case that had haunted the force for over a decade. The vehicle identification number was barely readable at first. Years of corrosion had nearly erased it, but with chemical treatment and micro-sanding, the original etching came into focus. The 17-character code was matched against national databases. There was no record of purchase, no registration, no dealership documentation. But the number wasn't unknown to everyone. A weathered memo from the original investigation, stored deep in the cold case archive, referenced a similar VIN range from a bulletin put out by the State Auto Theft Unit in 1985. The vehicle, based on forensic cross-checks, was confirmed to be the exact same model and probable match to to the dark blue sedan. Reported by witnesses, the night trooper Daniel Reese vanished. But what stunned the forensic team wasn't just the car itself, it was what they found inside. Carefully, using electric shears and precision tools, the crew began peeling back the warped interior. What remained of the car's front seat was mostly springs and foam ash, but buried within the twisted frame were fragments that didn't belong to the car, shreds of fabric, caught between the driver's seat and the crumpled floorboards. They were dark navy, almost blackened by time, but still carried traces of official issue. The weave, the stitching, the reinforced seams, they were from a Montana Highway Patrol uniform. More revealing was what came next. Underneath the dashboard, wedged between a collapsed bulkhead and the remnants of the steering column, one technician pulled out what at first looked like a coin. But under a cloth and gentle cleaning, it became clear. It was a shattered badge, split nearly in two from the crush. The top half bore the faint imprint of the state emblem, the lower half the ghost of a number, fractured but readable: 4573. It was Daniel Reese's. The lab went quiet. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to dull as the realization sank in. After 13 years of silence, the car had spoken. And it said Daniel had been there, had been in that car, alive or dead, long after his cruiser was found abandoned. Speculation rippled through the department. If Reese had been taken that night, was this the vehicle used to transport him? Had he been held in the back? Had he fought to escape? Or had something happened to him inside this very shell of steel and silence? Photographs were taken, evidence catalogued. The uniform fragments, the badge, and soil samples from the floorboards were all sent for deeper analysis. DNA testing would take time, but no one doubted the result. The presence of Reese's personal effects inside the sedan, undeniable, unmistakable, was more than just a development. It was a turning point. For 13 years, his disappearance had been a question without a mark. Now, with a crushed car and a broken badge, the story had begun to rewrite itself. And it carried the weight of something far darker than anyone had imagined. The lab technicians moved with surgical precision, their gloved hands careful not to disturb the fragile evidence that time had concealed. The vehicle, now stripped of its outer layers and suspended on a hydraulic lift, looked like a steel skeleton. Its twisted interior had already offered up fragments of a patrol uniform and the shattered remains of Trooper Daniel Reese's badge. But there was more to be found. Hidden in the crevices where the seats had once been, deep within the folds of collapsed metal and rotted upholstery, were dark stains long since dried, absorbed into foam and fabric. The discovery sent a ripple through the room. At first, the team wasn't sure what they were looking at. After more than a decade exposed to the elements, organic evidence was rare, often destroyed by moisture and decay. But when one technician extracted a rusted piece of carpeting from beneath the passenger seat and lifted it toward the light, there it was: deep reddish-brown discoloration, embedded into the fibers, nearly invisible at first glance. A rush of activity followed. Swabs were taken from multiple sections: the driver's side floor panel, the door hinge, and the hollow beneath the collapsed glove compartment. The samples were bagged, labeled, and sent immediately to the forensic DNA lab in Helena for analysis. No one dared speak what they were all thinking: blood. It took a week before the results came back, and when they did, the silence in the briefing room was heavy enough to suffocate. The DNA profile extracted from the stains was a perfect match to Trooper Daniel Reese. There was no ambiguity. The young officer had bled inside that car. But the report revealed something curious, disturbing, even. The total volume of blood detected was minimal, not enough to suggest a fatal injury had occurred in the vehicle. There were no arterial patterns, no pooling. Just small deposits, as if from a nosebleed or a shallow wound. The medical examiner reviewed the report twice and concluded that while the blood indicated some form of trauma, it didn't point to a violent death inside the car, which raised a much darker possibility. Daniel had survived the initial encounter, at least for a while. This revelation shifted the tone of the entire investigation. If Reese had been alive in that car, injured, bleeding, restrained, perhaps then he may have been taken somewhere afterward. The car wasn't a crime scene in the traditional sense. It was a vessel, a link in a longer, more concealed chain of events. Someone had used it, then hidden it, knowing full well what it contained. For years, it had sat silently under layers of metal and time, guarding its secret. And now, that secret was screaming to be heard. Speculation among detectives became frantic. Was the car used to transport Reese from the site of the abduction? Was he moved elsewhere and held against his will? Had he seen something he shouldn't have, something that made him a target? The blood was physical proof that he had suffered, but also a sliver of hope. A terrifying hope. It meant he hadn't died immediately. He had endured something after that night on Route 89. The discovery reignited the case. The press returned. The Reese family was notified, their emotions split between grief and renewed pain. And within the Montana Highway Patrol, quiet panic began to grow. Because if Daniel had lived beyond that night, the question that no one wanted to ask now hovered over every room, every meeting, every whispered conversation. Who kept him alive, and why? The footage was grainy, low resolution, and time-stamped with flickering red numbers that faded in and out at the bottom of the screen. It had sat untouched for years, buried in the back office of a long-defunct shipping warehouse that bordered the edge of the abandoned salvage yard. The building itself had been shuttered since the late 92nd. A victim of economic downturn and shifting transport routes, and had only recently been purchased by a construction firm looking to redevelop the area. As they gutted the interior, one of the workers found a stack of dusty VHS tapes inside a locked metal cabinet near the security station. They would have been discarded, junked with the old filing cabinets and broken fluorescent lights, if not for the curiosity of a junior site manager who decided to pop one into an ancient VCR they kept in the office for training videos. The tape was dated the 18th of October, 1985. The morning after Trooper Daniel Reese vanished. At first, the footage seemed unremarkable. Black and white images of the warehouse's rear lot flickered across the screen. Mostly empty asphalt, piles of wooden pallets, the rusting frame of an old trailer parked in the corner. Then, just after the timestamp rolled past 3:02 a.m., a pair of headlights appeared on the edge of the screen. A car crept slowly into the salvage yard through a rarely used side entrance, partially obscured by a row of shipping containers. It moved without urgency, deliberate and quiet, like someone who knew the cameras existed and didn't care. The vehicle was difficult to make out, but even through the grain and darkness, the silhouette was unmistakable. The boxy frame, the squared headlights, the long trunk, it matched the make and model of the crushed sedan found beneath the wreckage. The very same vehicle that had contained Daniel Reese's badge and uniform fragments. And now it was here, on tape, being disposed of like garbage. What truly chilled the blood of investigators wasn't just the car, it was the driver. When the vehicle came to a stop, the driver's side door opened. A figure stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with familiarity and confidence. For a few seconds, the figure moved into the glow of a distant floodlight, enough for the grainy image to pick up distinct details. The curve of a wide-brimmed hat, the glint of a badge near the chest, the unmistakable cut of a Montana Highway Patrol uniform. The person who dumped the car was dressed like a state trooper. The realization hit the task force like a hammer. Either the driver was a member of the force, or someone had access to the uniform and knew enough about procedure to convincingly mimic one. And if the latter, how did they get it? Reese's uniform was missing when he vanished. Had someone worn it to move the car in order to mislead the investigation? Or had Daniel Reese, injured, disoriented, been the one behind the wheel? Enhancements on the footage proved inconclusive. The resolution wasn't sharp enough to reveal facial features, and the badge glint could not confirm an identity. But the movements of the figure calm, practice suggested someone trained in the way troopers carried themselves. The implications were staggering. If a fellow officer was involved in the disposal of the vehicle, the case was no longer just a disappearance. It was a potential cover-up, the kind that required access, knowledge, and intent. For the first time since the case had resurfaced, the question of betrayal entered the conversation. The force began to look inward. Personnel files were re-examined. Transfers, retirements, sudden resignations around late 1985. Nothing was off the table now. Because if one of their own had buried that car under layers of rust and time, then Daniel Reese hadn't just vanished, he had been erased. The footage of the trooper-clad figure dumping the crushed sedan ignited a firestorm, not just within the Montana Highway Patrol, but across law enforcement communities statewide. Theories, once whispered cautiously in private conversations, began to emerge with more frequency and force, twisting the known facts into haunting possibilities. Among them, one idea took hold with disturbing traction. Someone had impersonated Daniel Reese. Or perhaps, in the unlikeliest and most chilling scenario, Daniel himself had somehow returned only to vanish once more. The press dubbed it the ghost officer theory, a name that fed the public's imagination as much as it disturbed investigators. The concept wasn't new. Over the years, even before the surveillance tape surfaced, there had been sporadic sightings reported by citizens who swore they saw a lone trooper walking a desolate stretch of highway or standing silently near abandoned patrol checkpoints late at night. Most of those sightings were dismissed as stress-induced misinterpretations, urban legend territory born from the tragedy of Reese's disappearance. But now, with video evidence showing someone in a patrol uniform tied directly to the disposal of the very car connected to Reese, those ghost stories began to feel less like fiction. One particular report from 1989 suddenly resurfaced in the wake of the footage. A retired gas station attendant in Havre, Montana, had claimed that a man in a trooper uniform stopped at his station around 2 a.m., asking for directions west toward the Canadian border. The man didn't speak much, had a bandage over his jaw, and seemed disoriented. He never paid for gas. The attendant hadn't thought much of it until he saw Reese's photo in the paper years later and swore it was the same man. At the time, the tip had been buried under dozens of wild claims, but now, in light of everything else, it was re-evaluated. Could Reese have escaped only briefly before being silenced again? Internally, the department was torn. Some officers refused to believe that one of their own could be behind any of it. Others quietly questioned the personnel files from 1985, pointing to a few troopers who had left the force shortly after. Reese vanished, early retirements, sudden relocations, medical discharges that were never fully explained. But no direct link could be proven, and the longer the theory lingered, the more surreal it became. Was Reese kidnapped and forced into compliance? Was someone parading in his uniform to throw investigators off the trail? Could someone have kept him alive, using his identity like a mask, only to eventually dispose of both man and evidence? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. Psychological profiles were pulled. Experts weighed in. They theorized that if Reese had survived whatever happened that night, he could have been suffering from trauma-induced amnesia or coerced into silence. Others believed the uniformed figure was part of an orchestrated effort to mislead and intimidate the department, using the familiar silhouette of one of their own as a weapon of confusion. Regardless of the truth, one thing became certain. The trooper seen in the video was not a stranger to protocol. The way they handled the vehicle, the confidence in their body language, the uniform's accuracy, none of it felt accidental. Whoever it was knew what they were doing, and they knew exactly what kind of ghost they were creating. As the theory spread, Daniel Reese stopped being just a name in a cold case file. He became something else, A haunting presence, a question with no answer, a symbol of betrayal within the badge. His face, once framed in hopeful yellowed flyers, now stared out from beneath headlines filled with suspicion. Whether he was dead, alive, or manipulated into something in between, the legend of the ghost officer had taken root, and it refused to be buried. The investigation had begun to curve inward. With the mysterious surveillance footage showing someone in a trooper's uniform dumping the very vehicle connected to Daniel Reese's disappearance, the Montana Highway Patrol was no longer just looking for an unknown suspect. They were looking at themselves. Files that had long sat untouched in personnel archives were reopened, reviewed, and dissected with new scrutiny. Background checks were rerun. Disciplinary records were combed for omissions or anomalies. And amid that sudden burst of internal reflection, one name stood out, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't. Retired Trooper Raymond Ray Merrick had been stationed in the same region as Reese back in 1985. At the time, he was a 14-year veteran, known for his no-nonsense attitude and a quiet disposition that kept him somewhat apart from the camaraderie of his fellow troopers. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't close with anyone either. He had trained a few rookies over the years, but never Daniel Reese. On paper, their paths barely intersected. And yet, something about Merrick's file gave investigators pause. Merrick had retired suddenly in the spring of 1986, just 6 months after Reese vanished, and shortly after the official search was scaled back. His reason? Early medical retirement due to stress and accumulated injuries. There was a single doctor's note, vague and unsigned by any specialist. The report listed back pain and mental exhaustion, but no scans, no treatment plan, and no follow-up. His exit was clean, too clean. More concerning was that Merrick's file had no citations, no complaints, no disciplinary actions, not even the standard performance reviews that were typically filed annually. For someone with over a decade of service, his record was suspiciously thin, almost curated. When Denning, now officially consulting on the reopened case, pressed for any off-the-record notes from supervisors, none could be found. One clerk admitted hesitantly that Merrick's file had been removed from active storage a few months after his retirement and temporarily relocated for internal review. No documentation explained why or who authorized it. Digging further, the task force discovered that Merrick had been on duty the same night. Reese disappeared, assigned to a neighboring sector only 40 minutes away from Route 89. His activity log for that shift, however, had been filed manually rather than digitally, and it was riddled with vague notations. Patrolled sector, no incidents, returned to base. Nothing about where exactly he was between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m., the critical window when Reese made his last radio call and vanished. Attempts to contact Merrick led nowhere. He had moved out of state, settling in a remote area of northern Idaho. When a pair of investigators made the trip to speak with him, they found a cabin tucked deep in the woods, nearly off the grid. Merrick answered the door, older now, thinner, his hair gone white and his voice rasped by age and suspicion. He declined to speak on record. "That case is dead," he said. "Let it stay that way." He never admitted to knowing anything, but he also never denied it. His eyes stayed fixed, cold and unreadable. And when asked if he remembered Reese, he paused too long before replying, barely. The visit only deepened suspicions. Back in Montana, a quiet unease spread through the department. Those who remembered Merrick began to murmur, recalling how distant he'd grown in the months after Reese disappeared, how he had pulled back from social events, avoided conversations, and how quickly he'd vanished after his retirement was approved. The theory was forming, heavy with implication. If Merrick knew something, if he had been involved, it would explain the quiet exit, the blank record, the silence. And it meant the betrayal went deeper than anyone had dared believe. It meant the truth about Daniel Reese might have always been buried behind a badge. The envelope was plain, unmarked, and slightly yellowed at the edges. It had no return address, no initials, nothing to give away who had sent it. Only the words, "To the Reese family," were scrawled in shaky handwriting across the front, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper. The postmark was smudged, but legible enough to raise alarms. Cold Creek, Montana, a ghost town that hadn't had a permanent resident in over 2 decades. 50 miles north of where Daniel had vanished, Cold Creek had once been a bustling mining outpost, now reduced to a scattering of collapsed shacks, rusted tools, and the memory of something long forgotten. Nothing and no one was supposed to be there. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, dropped through the mail slot at the Reese family home in Laurel. It was Daniel's younger sister, Erin, who discovered it while collecting the morning mail. She hadn't been expecting anything. No one wrote anymore. Not about Daniel, not after all these years. But the weight of the envelope felt different. Like it carried something old and important, something that didn't want to be remembered, yet refused to stay buried. She opened it at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, the edges brittle as if aged unnaturally fast. The message was typed old typewriter ink, faded and misaligned, as though written by someone who hadn't used a keyboard in decades. He saw something he wasn't supposed to. It wasn't an accident. That was all it said. No greeting, no signature, no explanation. Just that single sentence that cracked through the silence of 13 long years like a gunshot in a chapel. Erin sat frozen, rereading the message over and over, her pulse pounding in her ears. What had Daniel seen? Who had he told? And why now? Why send this, after so much time, from a place no one lived? She called the detectives working on the reopened case, her voice barely steady. Within hours, the letter was in evidence. The paper was scanned, fingerprinted, tested for fibers and chemical traces. Nothing usable. No prints. No hair. The envelope had been licked shut, but the DNA sample was too degraded for any match. Whoever sent it had been careful. The typewriter, though archaic, offered one clue. Forensic document analysts noted that the ink patterns and misalignments suggested an Olympia SM8 model manufactured in the 1962nd. Rare, but not impossible to find. A detail perhaps, but not yet a lead. The postmark was more intriguing. Cold Creek hadn't had a functioning post office since the late 72nd. The nearest working facility was in Elkhorn, a neighboring town 12 miles away, which meant someone had driven to Cold Creek specifically to use the old, abandoned postmarking equipment left in a derelict shack, the kind of thing only someone familiar with the place would know even existed. That narrowed the field. Cold Creek was off every major road, its few remaining structures hidden behind overgrowth and collapsed fencing. Anyone sending a letter from there wasn't trying to be found. They were trying to be remembered. For the first time, investigators had something they couldn't dismiss as coincidence or speculation. Someone out there knew what happened to Daniel. Someone had been holding onto a truth they hadn't dared to share until now. But the real question lingered like smoke in the cold air. What had Daniel seen that night? What secret had cost him his life or his freedom? And was the person behind that letter a witness, an accomplice, or something far worse? The trip to Cold Creek was meant to be routine, a perfunctory search to follow up on the letter's ghostly postmark, another box to tick on an investigation that had already blurred the line between obsession and duty. But the letter had hit a nerve, and the investigators weren't taking chances. A team of 6 officers, accompanied by a forensic specialist and a search dog, made the trek north. The town had long since fallen into ruin, swallowed by nature and time. What remained were rotting cabins, the skeletons of mining equipment, and the wind-blown remnants of a community that had died quietly. It was mid-morning when they arrived. Fog clung low to the ground, masking the decay in a gray, shifting veil. The silence was suffocating, no birdsong, no rustle of animals. Just the crunch of boots on gravel and the creak of rusted hinges as doors were pried open one by one. Most of the buildings were empty, collapsed inward, unsafe to enter. But about 100 yards behind what had once been the town's general store, a deputy noticed something odd, a square of earth that didn't match the rest. The grass had grown differently there, thinner, less wild. As they began to clear away the brush, they found what looked like a door. Not a trapdoor, not an old hatch, but a concealed wooden cover, reinforced with rusted metal and chained shut from the inside. It took half an hour to pry it open. The air that rose from the space below was damp and stale, thick with the scent of mold and rust. Flashlights swept over a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The structure was old, but not ancient, poured concrete walls reinforced with beams, the kind you might find in a survivalist's shelter or a Cold War-era fallout bunker. As the team descended, they found themselves in a cramped corridor that opened into a low-ceilinged room, roughly 12 feet by 12, lined with shelves, crates, and a single, rusted bed frame bolted to the floor. Then came the real discoveries. On the wall nearest the bed, a pair of handcuffs dangled from an iron loop. One cuff was open. The other was still locked shut, its hinge fused by rust. Beneath the bed were scraps of tattered fabric, some gray, some blue, one unmistakably part of a uniform sleeve with the faded outline of a state-issued badge still visible. Strewn across a small wooden table were yellowed sheets of paper, some barely legible, others smeared with moisture and age. But a few had survived. Written in shaky, frantic handwriting were desperate pleas, scrawled over and over. "They watch me, I can't scream. Day 43. I don't know who they are. Please help me, my name is Daniel Reese." The words stopped the room cold. The papers were immediately collected, sealed in evidence bags, and rushed to the lab. Handwriting analysts compared them to old forms and academy records. The preliminary result, highly likely to be Reese's. The ink was standard ballpoint. The dates, though sporadic, stretched into the spring of 1,986 months after Daniel had been presumed dead. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department. It confirmed a nightmare long whispered about behind closed doors. Daniel Reese had not died the night he disappeared. He had been taken, held, forgotten. The bunker was swept thoroughly, revealing no recent activity. Whoever had used it was long gone, but its presence, the things it contained, were undeniable. It was either a prison or a hiding place, or maybe both. And in that underground silence, Daniel had cried out for help in the only way he could. Now, finally, someone had heard him. The hidden bunker changed everything. What was once viewed as a tragic disappearance had transformed into something more chilling: prolonged captivity. With the notes found beneath the rotting floorboards of that concrete cell, the case of Trooper Daniel Reese shifted from a cold case to a haunting portrait of calculated cruelty. Experts were called in, not just criminal investigators, but behavioral analysts, hostage psychologists, and forensic historians. Each one arrived with a different lens, but they all agreed on one thing: Daniel hadn't died quickly. He had been alive for weeks, possibly months after the night he vanished. The writing in the notes reflected the slow deterioration of a person trapped without answers. The first few were structured, deliberate. He identified himself. He mentioned the date. He described the conditions: no light, 1 meal a day, chains on his legs. But as the pages went on, the structure dissolved into jagged thoughts, fractured sentences, and increasingly desperate cries for help. What horrified investigators most wasn't just the content. It was the eerie calm in some of the entries. As though Reese had accepted his fate, or worse, believed no one was coming. Experts began to sketch a grim timeline. If the last dated entry was accurate, Reese had been alive until at least March of 1986, nearly 5 months after he was reported missing. It was inconceivable to the task force. A manhunt had been conducted, roads combed, fields swept. Yet all the while, Daniel may have been hidden just 50 miles away, underground, beneath a town that had been declared abandoned for years. Then came the darker question: who had kept him there? The theory that once lingered at the fringes of the investigation, the one that spoke of betrayal from within, was now being taken seriously at the highest levels. For someone to capture a state trooper, detain him in secret for months, and then dispose of his uniform and badge in a crushed vehicle, deliberately hidden beneath scrap metal, it required more than just criminal intent. It required knowledge. It required access. And above all, it required time. The possibility that Daniel had stumbled upon something he was never meant to see gained sudden weight. His final radio call, the routine stop, was now viewed through a new lens. What if it hadn't been routine at all? What if he had pulled over the wrong vehicle? What if, in doing so, he had uncovered something that posed a threat, not just to himself, but to someone inside the very department he trusted? Whispers of corruption within the Montana Highway Patrol had existed for years, though nothing had ever been proven. But as detectives reviewed old internal affairs files, they found strange anomalies, reports that had gone missing, personnel who had quietly resigned after Reese's disappearance. And then there was Trooper Raymond Merrick, his abrupt retirement, his vague medical file, his cabin in the woods, and his refusal to answer questions. The survivor theory tore at the fabric of the department. If Reese had been targeted to silence him, then the conspiracy extended beyond a single rogue officer. It hinted at a network, however small, that had orchestrated a cover-up stretching over a decade. It also begged an unthinkable question. Had the department, knowingly or unknowingly, protected one of its own at the cost of a brother's life? Publicly, the force maintained its commitment to finding the truth. Privately, some officers began questioning the institution they had sworn loyalty to. Others feared that reopening the past would cost them their careers or worse. Daniel Reese, long thought to be a victim of chance or misfortune, was emerging as a witness silenced, not by a stranger, but possibly by someone who wore the same badge. And in that possibility lay the most terrifying truth of all. The fallout began quietly, almost too quietly for something so heavy. When the contents of the Cold Creek bunker were confirmed, when the analysts authenticated Daniel Reese's handwriting, and the forensic reports confirmed the uniform scraps and handcuffs were state-issued, the Montana Highway Patrol faced a reckoning it had never seen in its century-long history. Behind closed doors, meetings turned into interrogations, and the familiar rhythm of everyday operations was disrupted by an atmosphere so thick with tension it felt like a pressure cooker waiting to blow. Officially, the department called it a renewed internal audit. But those inside knew better. The command structure was shaken, top to bottom. Records from 1985 through 1987 were pulled from archives, scanned, reanalyzed. Retirement files were scrutinized. Old call logs were reviewed by external investigators, and the Internal Affairs Division that once shelved quiet complaints with well-practiced efficiency was now being overseen by a federal oversight team. No one, not even the highest-ranking officers, was exempt from questioning. Rumors bled through the station walls like smoke. Conversations died mid-sentence when certain names were mentioned. Officers who had once worn the badge with pride now eyed each other with suspicion. Veterans who'd been on the force in the mid-82nd were suddenly brought in for interviews, some multiple times. Their memories, once dusty with time, were now expected to be sharp, specific, and unflinching. Among those brought back into the spotlight was a name that had never made headlines, never even raised a flag during the original investigation. Lieutenant Charles Doran. In 1985, Doran had been a mid-level supervisor stationed just outside Billings. On paper, he had played no significant role in Reese's disappearance, nor was he ever connected to the manhunt. But what caught the attention of investigators now wasn't what he did. It was what he failed to do. During the night of Daniel's disappearance, Doran had been on shift, listed as the liaison between dispatch and field units. His name appeared on the sign-off sheet for that night's radio logs. However, key parts of those logs were missing. Calls made and received by Reese during the hour before he vanished had never been archived. At the time, it had been attributed to faulty equipment and dismissed. But now, investigators weren't so sure. When asked to come in for questioning, Doran complied once, offering polite, vague recollections and stating he had nothing useful to add. A second request was made. He declined. 3 days later, he handed in his resignation. It was a one-paragraph letter typed with mechanical precision. No farewell, no explanation, just a signature and a date. By the time investigators tried to follow up, Doran had disappeared. His home was found empty, his phone disconnected, bank accounts closed. Neighbors said he left early in the morning, loading his truck with a few suitcases and driving off without a word. No forwarding address, no digital trail. It was as if he had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. Inside the department, Doran's sudden departure sent waves of unease. Officers began to question who else might have known something, who else had stayed silent. The badge, once a symbol of integrity and unity, now felt like a burden to some, a scarlet letter to others. Younger troopers, who had grown up hearing the story of Daniel Reese as a tragic loss, now saw it as a betrayal woven into the fabric of their institution. The force was reacting not just to the evidence, but to the awakening guilt that had long been buried beneath duty and routine. An officer had vanished, not at the hands of a random criminal, but potentially because of a betrayal from within. And with Doran's vanishing act, it became clear that the answers might still be out there, walking in plain sight, wearing a face someone once trusted. The picture that had haunted investigators for more than a decade was finally beginning to sharpen. The facts, once scattered like broken glass, were slowly coming together to form a narrative too terrible to ignore. Trooper Daniel Reese had not simply vanished on a rainy October night. He had stopped the wrong car, and in doing so, he had seen something or someone that he was never supposed to see. The emerging theory, pieced together from forensic discoveries, witness testimony, and re-examined files, pointed to a chilling conclusion. Reese had intercepted a vehicle during a routine patrol, likely believing it to be just another late-night stop. But the occupants of that car were not ordinary civilians. Evidence now suggested the vehicle was carrying illegal cargo, most likely a shipment of narcotics or sensitive documents. Possibly both, and more crucially, it appeared that at least one of the people inside had direct ties to law enforcement. Not just a peripheral connection, but someone embedded in the very department Reese served. The details were inferred from what remained of the evidence. Notes found in the Cold Creek bunker described conversations Daniel overheard, cryptic references to the lieutenant and the route. He had written about threats made in the dark, about being told he saw too much. These were not the ramblings of a delusional man, they were entries made with a clear mind, a desperate attempt to document the truth as it happened, hour by hour, day by day. Daniel had been a witness to something criminal, something that implicated not just strangers, but someone within the badge-wearing brotherhood he trusted. Investigators believe that after he pulled over the car that night, Reese quickly realized the stop wasn't routine. The uniformed figure seen on the salvage yard tape may have been one of the people in that car, possibly even an officer already under investigation. What followed was swift and strategic. Reese was overpowered and taken before he could radio for help. His cruiser was left idling at the roadside, a distraction to delay response time, while he was transported north, eventually imprisoned in the hidden Cold Creek bunker. Why keep him alive? That question tormented everyone involved in the case. Analysts theorized that whoever was behind his abduction wasn't sure how much Reese had heard or seen. Killing him immediately might have been risky, especially if they believed he had relayed anything to dispatch. Holding him offered time to assess the threat, to decide how to control the damage. But time passed, and Daniel, resilient, uncooperative, refused to break. His notes hinted at resistance, at refusing to sign documents or give up information. He wrote about staying sharp, about not giving them the satisfaction. Eventually, those responsible must have decided that silence was the only solution. Daniel was never released. The uniform was stripped from him. His badge was shattered and buried inside a car that was crushed and hidden under decades of wreckage, a crude burial designed to erase his existence. This final theory, while supported by circumstantial evidence, has never been officially confirmed. Too many files were altered. Too many people vanished willingly or otherwise. But among the investigators, the force, and the family, it has become the accepted truth. Reese was not the victim of bad luck or a random act of violence. He was a casualty of corruption, a man who followed his training, upheld the law, and paid for it with his life. In the end, the tragedy of Daniel Reese lies not only in how he died, but in how long it took for anyone to admit why. On a crisp autumn morning, eerily similar to the one Daniel Reese disappeared into 13 years earlier, the Montana State Capitol held a somber ceremony. The flag was lowered to half-mast. Officers in full-dress uniforms stood in solemn formation, their polished boots reflecting the rising Sunday. At the center of it all, a framed photograph of Trooper Reese rested on a velvet-draped easel, his young face frozen in time, forever 24. The governor spoke briefly. So did the state police commissioner. Then came the words no one had ever dared to utter aloud: killed in the line of duty. It was a declaration of truth and a concession of failure. For years, Reese's status had lingered in bureaucratic limbo, neither confirmed dead nor declared alive. But after the evidence recovered from Cold Creek, the forensic link to the crushed sedan, and the overwhelming weight of the investigation's final conclusions, there was no longer room for ambiguity. Trooper Daniel Reese had died while performing his duty alone, outnumbered, and unseen. In the weeks following the announcement, the case took on a second life, not as a missing persons investigation, but as the cornerstone of a sweeping corruption probe that would send shockwaves through the state. The recovered sedan, once thought to be little more than a rusted relic, became a linchpin in a criminal case, implicating multiple individuals in and around law enforcement. Tire marks, fabric fibers, and trace DNA pointed to a small but tightly woven network of individuals involved in drug trafficking and evidence suppression. Some of them, former officers, others, contractors or intermediaries who had long evaded suspicion. Subpoenas followed, warrants were executed. Files long considered dormant were cracked open under federal supervision. It wasn't just about Daniel Reese anymore. It was about a pattern of corruption that had festered in the margins of law enforcement, protected by silence and proximity to power. Several individuals were indicted, though not all for crimes directly tied to Reese's death. Still, the investigation bore his name unofficially. Every press briefing, every courtroom whisper carried the same undertone. They had missed it then, but they would not miss it again. Despite the revelations, there was still no closure. The one person who might have filled in the blanks, the sender of the anonymous letter, remained at large. Attempts to trace the letter's origin ended in frustration. The postmark was real, but no fingerprints, no clear identifiers had been left behind. The typewriter used was never recovered. It was as though the sender had surfaced only for a moment, dropped a match into a long dried trail of gasoline, and vanished into the smoke. The Reese family accepted the folded flag and the plaque bearing Daniel's name, now etched permanently into the granite wall of Montana's fallen officers. But their eyes held more than grief. There was pride, certainly, but also a sadness that justice had arrived so late and in pieces. Daniel Reese became more than a victim. He became a symbol. His story was taught in training academies, studied in ethics seminars, and spoken of in the locker rooms and back offices of law enforcement agencies statewide. His name reminded officers that truth does not always surface when it should, but when it does, it must be honored. Justice had finally stirred for Daniel Reese. It had come slowly, uneasily, and with no guarantee of completeness. The letter writer was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, but one truth had finally broken through. Daniel hadn't been forgotten. And that, for now, was enough.